At my granddaughter's wedding, they handed me a name tag that said, "The Absent Old Lady," and everyone in that ballroom smiled like it was the funniest thing they had ever seen. I just stood there holding the little cream-colored card between my fingers while the string quartet continued playing near the marble staircase, and waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne through the crowd. For a moment, I honestly thought there had been some mistake. Maybe someone printed the wrong card. Maybe it belonged to a joke table or some ridiculous bridal party game I didn't understand. But then I looked up and saw my granddaughter Sophia watching me from across the ballroom with that polished smile she had perfected sometime during law school. The kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Grandma," she called sweetly as she walked toward me in her custom ivory gown. "Don't look so serious. It's just an inside joke." Around us, several guests chuckled softly into their champagne glasses. I smiled politely because women my age learn very early that humiliation becomes even uglier when displayed publicly. "Of course," I said quietly. "How silly of me." Sophia leaned forward and kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. Even her affection felt expensive and rehearsed now. "Your table is near the back beside the catering entrance," she added casually before turning back toward her friends. "Oh, and thank you again for helping with the wedding fund." Helping. That word settled into my chest heavier than it should have. I had paid for nearly everything in that ballroom. The floral arches covered in white roses imported from Oregon. The 12-tier wedding cake standing beneath crystal chandeliers. The jazz band scheduled for later that evening. Even the honeymoon suite upstairs overlooking Lake Michigan. But somehow I had become the absent old lady. I walked slowly through the ballroom, careful not to trip over the hem of my navy blue evening dress. The hotel smelled faintly of gardenias and polished wood. Every table sparkled beneath candlelight. Guests laughed loudly, glasses clinked together, photographers moved through the crowd capturing moments that would later appear perfect online. Yet as I passed groups of people, I noticed something strange in the way they looked at me. Curious, sympathetic, some even uncomfortable. Near the bar, I overheard a woman whisper softly to her husband. "That must be the grandmother Sophia mentioned. The one who disappeared for years." Her husband nodded. "Sad, isn't it?" I kept walking, though my stomach tightened with every step. Disappeared for years. I suddenly realized this wasn't just a cruel joke printed on cardstock. It was a story. A story they had been telling people about me long before tonight. When I finally reached my assigned table near the kitchen doors, I sat down alone beside two distant relatives I barely recognized. From there, I could see the entire ballroom, but somehow felt invisible inside it. On the giant projector screen above the dance floor, a slideshow of family photographs slowly began to play. Sophia at age 6. Sophia graduating college. Family vacations in Aspen. Christmas mornings. Birthday dinners. Hundreds of memories floated across the screen beneath soft piano music. I stared quietly at each photo as they appeared one after another. Then something cold settled over me. I wasn't in a single one. I sat there watching photograph after photograph glide across the projector screen, while soft piano music echoed through the ballroom. The audience smiled at each image exactly the way people are supposed to during weddings. They laughed at childhood pictures. They wiped tears during graduation slides. They admired beach vacations and Christmas mornings framed in perfect golden light. But the longer the slideshow continued, the more I realized what felt wrong about it. I was missing from almost every memory. Not accidentally missing, carefully removed. In one photograph, I recognized the old lake house in Wisconsin where we spent every summer after my husband passed away. Sophia stood on the dock holding a fishing pole beside my son Daniel. The image had clearly been cropped. I remembered taking that picture myself before handing the camera to someone else so they could include me in the family portrait afterward. But that second photograph never appeared. Another slide showed Thanksgiving dinner from 8 years earlier. Claire stood smiling beside the turkey while Daniel poured wine into crystal glasses. Sophia sat between them laughing. The seat at the end of the table where I had spent that evening carving pies and refilling drinks had vanished completely from the frame. I folded my hands tightly in my lap as realization slowly settled into me like cold rain. This was not a wedding slideshow. It was evidence. Someone had spent years editing me out of the family story. A waiter approached my table carrying a tray of champagne flutes. He offered drinks to everyone seated beside me before giving me a brief apologetic smile. "I am sorry," he said softly. These are reserved for immediate family. Immediate family. I thanked him anyway and watched him walk away. Across the ballroom, Sophia stood near the center dance floor greeting guests while photographers circled around her like satellites. Every few seconds she adjusted her smile, depending on who approached. Wealthy relatives received warm hugs. Business associates received polished handshakes. Elderly guests received carefully rehearsed sympathy. She was good at it, better than I had ever realized. "Evelyn," a familiar voice asked quietly behind me. I turned and saw Margaret Dean standing there holding a small silver purse against her chest. I had not seen her in almost 10 years. She used to work with my late husband at the bank before retiring to Arizona. "Margaret," I said, surprised. "I did not know you were invited." Her expression shifted awkwardly. "Sophia asked me to come because she said family support meant everything after everything you put them through." I stared at her for a moment without speaking. What exactly did she say I put them through? Margaret hesitated. Then she lowered herself carefully into the chair beside me. "Evelyn, I thought maybe you knew." My stomach tightened again. Around us, laughter continued rising beneath sparkling chandeliers, while silverware clinked softly against expensive china. Somewhere near the ballroom entrance, the wedding band began tuning instruments for the first dance. Yet suddenly all I could hear was Margaret's voice. "Sophia told people you left the family after your husband died," she said carefully. "She said Daniel had to raise himself emotionally because you shut everyone out and disappeared whenever they needed you." I looked toward the dance floor where my granddaughter stood smiling beneath white roses I had paid for myself. Then I remembered every tuition bill, every mortgage payment, every emergency loan quietly transferred without hesitation. I remembered babysitting Sophia for entire summers while Daniel rebuilt his struggling career. I remembered standing outside hospitals, school auditoriums, funeral homes, birthday dinners. I had been present for all of it, every single moment. They had simply rewritten the story afterward. Margaret kept her voice low after that, almost as if she were afraid someone nearby might overhear us. "Sophia made it sound like Daniel survived in spite of you," she said carefully. "I am sorry, Evelyn. I should not have believed it so easily." I smiled faintly and looked down at the untouched linen napkin folded beside my plate. "Most people believe the version of a story that sounds cleaner," I replied. "A selfish old woman is easier to explain than a family built on quiet sacrifices." Margaret reached for my hand briefly before standing again to greet someone across the room. I remained at the table alone while the wedding lights dimmed slightly for the first dance. Soft amber spotlights swept across the ballroom ceiling like slow-moving waves. Guests gathered near the dance floor holding up phones to record every perfect second. Sophia glided into the center of the room beside her fiancé, Andrew Whitmore, whose family owned several luxury hotels along the East Coast. He looked proud standing beside her. Proud and unsuspecting. Watching them together, I suddenly remembered the first time Sophia had called me crying during her sophomore year at Northwestern. She had maxed out 3 credit cards and could not afford tuition for the spring semester. "Please do not tell my father," she whispered through tears over the phone that night. "He already thinks I waste money." I transferred $38,000 into her account the following morning before driving 2 hours through snow just to leave groceries at her apartment doorstep because she admitted she had not eaten properly in days. She hugged me tightly that afternoon. "You always save me," she said. At the time, I believed she meant it. Another memory surfaced while the guests applauded the newlyweds beneath sparkling chandeliers. Daniel sitting across from me 15 years earlier in my kitchen after his software company nearly collapsed during the recession. His hands trembled around a coffee mug while he admitted he might lose the house. Claire cried quietly beside him. I remember opening the old cedar cabinet where my husband kept investment documents and removing bonds I had promised myself never to touch. $220,000. Enough to save the company. Enough to save their marriage at the time, too, or so I thought. Daniel hugged me before leaving that night. "I do not know what we would do without you, Mom." Yet somehow, over the years, gratitude slowly transformed into embarrassment. Then embarrassment transformed into revision. I looked up as applause filled the ballroom once again. Sophia and Andrew kissed gently at the center of the dance floor while guests cheered around them. Behind me, 2 women whispered near the dessert table. I heard she disappeared after her husband died. One murmured quietly. Sophia practically raised herself. The other woman sighed sympathetically. That explains why they are not close. I stared at the wedding cake, glowing beneath soft candlelight. Vanilla buttercream, hand-painted sugar flowers, gold detailing imported from a bakery in Manhattan. I had approved every design sample personally, because Sophia claimed planning the wedding overwhelmed her emotionally. Suddenly, the entire ballroom felt staged around a lie so polished that even strangers repeated it with confidence. Then my eyes drifted toward the head table, where framed family photographs decorated the centerpiece display beside white orchids and candles. There was a picture of Sophia at age 10 riding a bicycle, another from her high school graduation, another from a Christmas ski trip in Colorado. I recognized every moment instantly because I had been there for all of them. But in every single frame, I had vanished. The wedding coordinator announced dinner a few minutes later, and guests slowly drifted toward their assigned tables beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. The ballroom smelled of rosemary chicken, warm bread, and expensive perfume. Servers moved gracefully between tables pouring wine, while a jazz trio played softly near the far wall. Everything looked elegant enough to belong in a bridal magazine. Yet the longer I sat there, the more artificial it all began to feel, like a carefully staged performance where everyone already knew their lines except me. I unfolded the cream-colored menu resting beside my plate and noticed my name had been printed incorrectly beneath the seating chart. Not Evelyn Carter. Just Evelyn. No family name attached to it at all. Across the room, every other guest card included full names, titles, and relationships to the bride or groom. Mother of the bride, cousin of the groom, family friends. But beside my chair, there was nothing identifying me except that strange emptiness. A young server leaned toward me politely while filling water glasses. "Would you like the family photo package delivered to your table later this evening?" he asked. The bride said immediate family receives complimentary copies. Before I could answer, Claire suddenly appeared beside him with a tight smile. "That will not be necessary," she interrupted quickly. "We already handled Grandma's arrangements." Grandma, not Mom, not Evelyn. Just the title stripped down until it barely sounded human anymore. Claire rested one manicured hand lightly against the server's arm and guided him away before he could speak again. I watched her disappear toward the head table where Daniel sat laughing beside Andrew's father. My son had not looked directly at me once all evening. Not once. Years ago, Daniel used to call me every Sunday morning no matter where he was. Even during business trips. Even during difficult years after his father died. Sometimes he would sit quietly on the phone while drinking coffee, talking about work stress, or asking for advice about Sophia. "She listens to you more than anyone," he once admitted during one of those conversations. "You calm her down." I believed we were still a family back then. I believed love could survive small disappointments if people remained honest with one another. But dishonesty grows quietly inside families. It starts with tiny revisions, small omissions, harmless jokes repeated often enough that they become accepted truth. Over time, memory itself begins changing shape. "You look beautiful tonight, Evelyn." The voice startled me gently. I looked up and saw Andrew standing beside the table adjusting the cuff of his tuxedo. Up close, he appeared exhausted beneath the polished smile he wore for guests. "Thank you," I replied softly. "You and Sophia planned a lovely evening." He smiled politely before lowering his voice. "I am glad you came. Sophia said you usually avoid family events." There it was again. Another version of me I did not recognize. I held his gaze calmly for a moment. "Did she say why?" Andrew hesitated. "Only that large gatherings make you uncomfortable." I almost laughed then, though nothing about the evening felt amusing anymore. I had spent 30 years hosting charity galas, business dinners, holiday parties, and fundraising events beside my late husband. I knew how to navigate crowded rooms better than anyone in that ballroom. But somehow, little by little, they had transformed me into a ghost inside my own family story. Andrew glanced towards Sophia waiting near the dance floor for photographs. "I should get back," he said apologetically. Then he paused. "For what it is worth, I think Sophia wishes things had been different between all of you." I smiled faintly and folded my napkin carefully across my lap. "No," I said quietly. "I think Sophia wishes people believed they already were." Dinner plates were cleared away slowly while conversations softened into the comfortable hum wealthy people create when they feel impressed by their own surroundings. Candlelight flickered across crystal glasses. Outside the towering ballroom windows, downtown Chicago shimmered against the dark water of Lake Michigan. Somewhere near the entrance, hotel staff rolled in a massive dessert display covered in white orchids and gold sugar ribbons. Guests applauded again as if every moment needed an audience. I remained seated quietly near the back of the room, watching people who barely knew my family celebrate a version of it that had never existed. Then I noticed Daniel walking toward me for the first time that evening. His tuxedo jacket hung slightly crooked at the shoulders the way it always did when he felt nervous. Even as a boy, he adjusted his clothing constantly whenever he wanted to avoid difficult conversations. He stopped beside my table and rested one hand lightly against the empty chair across from me. "Mom," he said softly. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him now. "Are you enjoying yourself?" I looked at him carefully before answering. There were more gray hairs at his temples than I remembered, deep lines beneath his eyes. For one brief moment, I saw the exhausted young father who used to fall asleep on my living room couch after working 16-hour days, trying to keep his company alive. "It is certainly memorable," I replied calmly. Daniel exhaled quietly and glanced toward the crowded ballroom before lowering himself into the chair. "Sophia can be dramatic sometimes," he said. "You know how she is." I almost smiled at that. People always describe cruelty as personality when they benefit from it. "Do I?" I asked gently. Daniel rubbed his wedding band slowly with his thumb. "Look, tonight is important for her. Andrew's family cares a lot about appearances. Everyone has been under pressure." Appearances. Such a fragile word to build a family around. I folded my hands together and studied my son carefully beneath the candlelight. "Did you tell people I abandoned you after your father died?" His eyes lifted toward mine immediately, startled enough that he forgot to hide it. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. Around us, the jazz trio continued playing soft standards while waiters refreshed wine glasses. Finally, Daniel looked down again. "It was not like that," he muttered quietly. "Then how was it?" He swallowed hard before speaking. "Sophia struggled after Dad passed away. She said you became distant emotionally." Claire agreed it would be easier to explain things that way to people. "Easier?" I stared at him in silence. "Easier than admitting they took my money while slowly pushing me outside the family circle. Easier than explaining why every holiday invitation became shorter. Why phone calls disappeared unless someone needed financial help. Why photographs no longer included me even when I stood in the room beside them." Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice further. "Mom, please do not make tonight difficult." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Difficult?" I repeated softly. "Daniel, I spent 27 years making your life easier." He flinched almost imperceptibly at the words. Then his eyes drifted toward the ballroom entrance where Sophia stood laughing beside Andrew's parents beneath a wall of white roses. "You do not understand how much this wedding means for her future," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I think I finally understand exactly what it means." Before he could respond, another voice interrupted from behind us. Evelyn Carter. Calm. Familiar. Controlled. I turned slowly and saw Martin Hayes standing near the edge of the ballroom, holding a dark leather folder against his chest. My late husband's attorney had not changed much in the last decade except for the silver now threading through his hair. Daniel's face drained of color the moment he saw him. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The music continued drifting through the ballroom, while guests laughed beneath the chandeliers, completely unaware of the silence settling over our table. Martin stood calmly beside me in his dark charcoal suit, holding the leather folder against his chest with both hands like something fragile. Daniel rose from his chair so quickly it nearly scraped against the marble floor. "Martin," he said stiffly, "I did not know you were invited." "I was not," Martin replied evenly. "Evelyn asked me to stop by if necessary." Necessary. The words seemed to tighten the air around us immediately. Daniel glanced toward the head table where Claire sat speaking with Andrew's parents. Then he lowered his voice. "Tonight is not the time for legal conversations." Martin looked at him calmly. "Your father disagreed." My chest tightened slightly at the mention of my husband. Even after 11 years, hearing someone refer to him aloud still carried a strange weight. Daniel folded his arms defensively. "Dad has been gone a long time." "Yes," Martin said quietly, which is precisely why he prepared carefully before he passed. I watched my son's face pale beneath the ballroom lights. Somewhere across the room, Guests began gathering near the dance floor again, while photographers arranged relatives for formal portraits. Sophia stood at the center of the crowd, adjusting her veil while smiling effortlessly for cameras. She had no idea Martin was there yet. "Evelyn," Martin said gently, turning toward me now, "may we speak privately for a moment?" I nodded once and rose carefully from my chair. Daniel immediately stepped forward. "Mom, whatever this is, it can wait until after the wedding." I looked at him quietly. "Apparently my absence could not wait all these years," I replied. He said nothing after that. Martin guided me toward a quieter hallway just outside the ballroom, where framed black and white photographs of old Chicago lined the walls. The music became softer there, distant, almost peaceful. Hotel staff passed occasionally carrying trays of champagne or folded linens, but otherwise the corridor remained empty. Martin exhaled slowly once we were alone. "I hoped I would never need to come tonight," he admitted. "But after receiving your message this afternoon, I reviewed your husband's files again." He opened the leather folder carefully and removed several neatly organized documents. I recognized my husband's signature immediately across the top page. Even after all these years, I could still picture the exact way his hand moved while writing. Strong, precise, deliberate. 3 years before his death, Martin continued softly, "Your husband amended the family trust." I looked up at him slowly. "Why?" Martin hesitated for the first time all evening. "Because he noticed patterns." The hallway suddenly felt colder around me. "What kind of patterns?" I asked quietly. Martin adjusted his glasses before answering. He believed certain members of the family were slowly isolating you socially while remaining financially dependent on you. At first, he thought it was ordinary family tension. But over time, he documented repeated incidents involving exclusion, manipulation, and public disrespect. I stared at the papers in silence while memories flickered through my mind like old photographs. Holidays where my invitations arrived late. Vacations planned without mentioning dates to me. Birthday dinners where I somehow ended up paying quietly at the end of the night while everyone else left early. Small humiliations. Tiny cuts. So many that eventually they stopped feeling accidental. "Your husband included a protective clause," Martin said finally. "If any beneficiary intentionally damaged your reputation, isolated you from the family structure, or publicly misrepresented your role in order to secure greater access to family assets, their inheritance rights could be permanently revoked." My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the document. "Does Daniel know this?" Martin looked back toward the ballroom entrance where distant laughter echoed through the corridor. Judging by his reaction when he saw me, he said quietly, "I believe he remembers exactly what his father warned him about." I looked down at my husband's signature again while distant applause echoed from the ballroom behind us. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice the way it sounded during the final winter before he passed away. Calm, careful, always noticing things other people ignored. Back then, I thought his questions about the family came from ordinary concern. I did not realize he had already begun preparing for something much darker. "There is more," Martin said quietly. He removed another document from the folder and handed it to me gently. It was a trust release agreement dated 6 months earlier. Sophia's signature covered the bottom line in elegant looping handwriting. I scanned the paragraph beneath it slowly. In order to receive the final distribution from the Whitmore Carter family trust following her marriage ceremony, all direct heirs must be physically present and publicly acknowledged during the wedding event. My eyes lifted toward Martin immediately. "That is why they wanted me here," I said softly. He nodded once. "Without your attendance tonight, the final trust transfer could not legally activate." Suddenly, everything made terrible sense. The invitation that arrived after months of silence. Claire insisting on my attendance during phone calls that felt strangely rehearsed. Sophia suddenly sending flowers to my house for the first time in years. None of it had been reconciliation. It had been paperwork. I let out a slow breath and looked back toward the ballroom doors where music swelled again beneath bursts of laughter. "How much?" I asked quietly. Martin hesitated. "Roughly $8 million once the family properties are liquidated over time." $8 million. I stared at the number without emotion. My husband spent decades building that wealth carefully through investments, long nights, and endless business travel. He believed financial stability protected families from desperation. Instead, it seemed to have taught mine how to perform affection when necessary. There is another detail you should know, Martin continued carefully. Your husband specifically included language regarding reputational manipulation. I looked up again. Meaning? Martin adjusted the papers slowly before answering. If beneficiaries knowingly create a false narrative portraying you as emotionally absent, unstable, or neglectful in order to justify financial distancing while preserving access to trust assets, the inheritance clause becomes void immediately. My fingers tightened around the edge of the documents. For several seconds, I said nothing at all. Somewhere inside the ballroom, Sophia's voice rose brightly over the microphone thanking guests for attending the wedding. The audience applauded warmly after every sentence. She sounded graceful, charming, believable. Martin lowered his voice further. Evelyn, I reviewed several recordings, messages, and witness statements your husband archived before his death. He anticipated this exact pattern. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard had seen it years before I allowed myself to admit it. He noticed the way invitations slowly excluded me unless money was involved. The way Sophia rolled her eyes whenever I offered emotional advice, but smiled warmly whenever tuition payments arrived. The way Daniel avoided confrontation because acknowledging the truth would require choosing sides. What happens now? I asked quietly. Martin looked toward the ballroom entrance again. Legally, you can enforce the clause tonight if you choose. I stood silently in the hallway while hotel staff moved around us, carrying silver trays toward the reception. The scent of vanilla cake drifted faintly through the air. Then I noticed something strange through the partially open ballroom doors. On the giant projector screen near the dance floor, another slideshow had begun playing for guests. More family photographs. More edited memories. But this time a sentence appeared beneath one of the images in elegant gold script. Some people are only family when money is involved. Soft laughter spread across the ballroom immediately after the slide appeared. Sophia stood near the screen smiling while guests glanced casually toward the hallway where I stood hidden beside Martin. She knew exactly what she was doing. Martin followed my gaze quietly. Your husband once told me something, he said softly. He said the cruelest people rarely scream. They rewrite history while smiling politely. I looked at Sophia standing beneath the chandeliers wearing the wedding dress I had helped pay for. Then I folded the documents carefully and handed them back to Martin. Do not activate anything yet, I said calmly. Not until everyone hears the full story first. When Martin and I walked back into the ballroom together, the reception had shifted into that softer part of the evening where people become louder from champagne and sentimentality. Guests crowded near the dance floor holding cocktails while the jazz band played an old Frank Sinatra song beneath golden lights. Servers moved through the room carrying tiny desserts balanced carefully on silver trays. Everything still looked elegant from a distance. Perfect, even. But perfection becomes fragile once truth enters the room. I noticed Daniel immediately the moment we stepped back inside. His shoulders stiffened when he saw the leather folder still tucked beneath Martin's arm. Claire whispered something urgently into his ear while trying to keep her smile frozen for nearby guests. Across the ballroom, Sophia stood near the wedding cake speaking with Andrew's mother. She looked radiant beneath the chandeliers, glowing with the confidence of someone who believes every detail is under control. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage holding a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced warmly, before dessert is served, our beautiful bride would like to invite someone very special to say a few words. A spotlight moved slowly across the ballroom until it stopped directly on me. Around the room, hundreds of eyes turned at once. Sophia smiled sweetly from beside the stage. Grandma Evelyn, she said into the microphone. Would you come up here? Her voice sounded affectionate enough to fool strangers completely. A few guests applauded politely while I remained seated for one brief second longer. Then I stood. The ballroom grew strangely quiet as I walked toward the stage beside Martin. I could feel people watching me carefully now, curious about the elderly woman hidden at the back of the room all evening. Sophia extended one manicured hand toward me the moment I reached the stage steps. Everyone, she said brightly, my grandmother wanted to share some thoughts tonight. Wanted? Another polished lie wrapped in perfect manners. I accepted the microphone calmly and turned toward the audience while Sophia stepped gracefully aside. The ballroom lights looked almost blinding from the stage. Crystal glasses shimmered across hundreds of tables. Expensive tuxedos, designer gowns, smiling faces waiting politely for a sentimental speech about love and family. For a moment, no one spoke at all. Even the band had gone silent. I held the microphone gently between both hands and looked directly at the giant projector screen still displaying edited family photographs behind me. Family stories are interesting things, I said softly. My voice echoed clearly through the ballroom. The longer they are repeated, the more people mistake them for truth. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sophia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly beside me. Tonight, I continued calmly. I learned that many people here believe I abandoned my family years ago, that I disappeared emotionally after my husband died, that I only appear when money is involved. The ballroom became completely silent then. Somewhere near the back, a glass clinked softly against silverware before stopping abruptly. I glanced toward Daniel sitting frozen beside Claire. He could not look at me anymore. What fascinates me most, I said quietly, is how carefully false stories must be maintained. Photographs edited. Memories revised. Invitations delayed. Phone calls unanswered unless a check is needed. Sophia stepped slightly closer beside me. "Grandma," she whispered tightly through her smile, "this is not appropriate." I turned toward her gently. "No," I replied softly into the microphone. What was inappropriate was placing an old woman at the back of a ballroom after using her presence to unlock $8 million. Gasps rippled instantly across the room. Andrew's expression changed immediately beside the wedding cake. "What?" he said aloud before catching himself. Sophia's face lost color for the first time all evening. Claire stood abruptly from her chair, while Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like a man watching years of avoidance collapse all at once. I looked toward Martin standing quietly near the stage stairs, then back toward the audience. "You were all told I was absent," I said calmly. "But absence is difficult to prove when someone paid for nearly everything in this room." The silence after my words felt heavier than the music ever had. No one moved at first. Guests sat frozen beneath the chandeliers holding untouched champagne glasses while the projector screen behind me continued cycling through edited photographs no one seemed interested in anymore. Andrew stared at Sophia with an expression that looked less like anger and more like confusion. The kind that arrives when someone suddenly realizes they may not know the person standing beside them at all. Sophia recovered first. She always did. Her shoulders straightened beneath the white satin of her gown, and she stepped toward the microphone with a tight smile still fixed carefully across her face. "I think my grandmother may be overwhelmed emotionally tonight," she said lightly to the audience. Losing Grandpa affected all of us differently. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one laughed this time. I remained calm beside her. "Your grandfather died 11 years ago," I said softly into the microphone. "But apparently I only became useful again 6 months ago when this trust agreement required my attendance." Martin stepped forward then and handed a copy of the document directly to Andrew. The young man scanned the first page slowly while Sophia's expression finally began cracking around the edges. "Andrew," she whispered sharply, "do not do this here." He ignored her completely. Across the ballroom, Daniel stood motionless beside Claire, looking suddenly much older than he had earlier that evening. I watched my son carefully as years of silence settled visibly across his face. He knew every word I spoke was true. That was the tragedy of it. Not betrayal. Cowardice. "This cannot be serious," Claire said suddenly, her voice trembling slightly as she approached the stage. "Evelyn, you are humiliating the family." I looked at her quietly beneath the ballroom lights. "No," I replied calmly. "The family humiliated itself long before tonight." Somewhere near the back of the room, a guest quietly placed her champagne glass down on the tablecloth. Another guest lowered his phone after realizing this was no longer entertainment. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely now. Not loud, not chaotic, just unbearably honest. Andrew finally looked up from the papers in his hands. "Sophia," he said carefully, "did your grandmother really pay for most of this wedding?" Sophia hesitated for half a second too long. That was all it took. "She offered," she answered tightly, "because she felt guilty." Guilty. I almost smiled hearing that word. Martin calmly removed another document from the folder and handed it toward Andrew without speaking. "These are bank transfers covering the venue deposit, catering contract, floral arrangements, honeymoon suite, and educational loans dating back 12 years, he explained evenly. Mrs. Carter financed nearly every major expense connected to this family. Andrew read silently, while Sophia's breathing became visibly uneven. Around the ballroom, guests no longer pretended not to listen. Truth has a way of quieting entire rooms. Daniel finally stepped forward then, his voice low and exhausted. "Mom," he said softly, "please." I turned toward him slowly. For a brief second, I saw the little boy who used to wait by the front window for me after elementary school. The teenager who cried quietly at his father's funeral because he thought he needed to stay strong for me. The young man who once promised he would never let me feel alone. "I waited years for one of you to correct the story," I said gently. "None of you ever did." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. Sophia suddenly reached for Andrew's arm, but he stepped back almost instinctively. That movement hurt her more than anything else tonight. I could see it plainly. Not the trust, not the money, the loss of control. I handed the microphone quietly back to the master of ceremonies before turning toward the ballroom entrance. No one tried stopping me this time. As I walked slowly across the marble floor, guests moved aside without speaking. Near the doorway, I reached up and removed the small name tag still pinned to my dress. I looked at the words one final time beneath the soft golden lights. Then I dropped it gently into a silver trash bin beside the exit and walked out into the cold Chicago night, feeling lighter than I had in years.